Today, we are going to review one of the most talked about financial history books of the year, 1929 Inside the Greatest Crash in Wall Street History by Andrew Ross Sorkin. This is a book that's already hit number one on the New York Times bestseller list and been named one of the best books of 2025 by The Economist, Bloomberg, among other publications. The author, Andrew Ross Sorkin, is an award-winning journalist, a New York columnist, and co-anchor of CNBC's Squawk Box. He also founded Dealbook, an influential financial newsletter and summit. Sorkin burst into the literary scene with his 2009 bestseller Too Big to Fail, which chronicled the 2008 financial crisis and was later adapted into an Emmy-nominated HBO film. He is even credited as a co-creator of the hit show series Billions. To write this book, 1929, Sorkin says he had spent over a decade researching, mining archives from Harvard to the Library of Congress to reconstruct this pivotal moment in American history. So let's start with an overview of the book. For starters, this book is not merely a chronicle of a stock market crash. It's an immersive, character-driven epic that reads like a financial thriller, structured as a tragedy in 3 acts: the delusion, the crash, and the reckoning. Sorkin takes us behind the ticker tape and into the boardrooms, mansions, and political backrooms where the fate of the American economy was decided by a handful of ambitious, often deluded men. The book opens on October 28, 1929, with Charles Mitchell, chairman of National City Bank, the predecessor to the current Citibank, with the man returning to his office after a catastrophic 13% market drop. Mitchell, known as Sunshine Charlie for his relentless optimism, had already bet everything on an endless bull market. Most importantly, he had orchestrated a deal to acquire Corn Exchange Bank, a major institution at the time. And that was by giving them back stocks of the Citibank shares. So the deal, in essence, hinged on Mitchell's bank's stock price remaining high. So in order to achieve that, he pushed his bank to buy tens of thousands of its own stock. But still, the market kept sliding, and along with it, the price of the bank's stock. So facing potential ruin of his bank, Mitchell made a desperate decision, personally borrowing $12 million from JP Morgan to buy his own bank's collapsing stock to save the deal. Well, this is the kind of granular human drama that defines Sorkin's approach and makes the book stand out. He talks not only of business and economy in big numbers, structures, and systems, but ultimately about people and the decisions they make. And from that dramatic opening, Sorkin then rewinds back to February 1929, introducing us to his ensemble cast. There is Thomas Lamont, the senior partner at JP Morgan, who acts as the firm's diplomatic fixer, negotiating German war reparations in Paris on behalf of the American government, while secretly scheming to create a global communications monopoly. There is William Durant, the founder of General Motors, turned reckless speculator who organizes massive pools to manipulate stock prices and who travels incognito to the White House to warn the President Hoover against the Federal Reserve's actions, to protect his bottom line, of course. And then there is Jesse Livermore, the legendary boy plunger, a short seller who made fortunes betting against the market in 1907 and would do so again in 1929, only to lose everything in the 1930s and take his own life in 1940. And then there is Joan Raskeb, the DuPont and General Motors executive who chaired the Democratic National Committee and promoted the idea that everyone ought to be rich, of course, through stock market investing. The book meticulously documents the mechanisms that inflated the bubble, margin buying that allowed investors to purchase stocks with just 10% down, investment trusts that piled leverage upon leverage, and stock pools, essentially legal pump and dump schemes, where insiders trade stocks back and forth to create the illusion of volume, driving the prices in a few days before dumping them on retail investors, netting the pool millions in profit. Sorkin also focuses on the failure of institutions. The Federal Reserve Bank, only 15 years old at the time and internally divided, attempted to curb the rampant stock market speculation but lacked the will to raise interest rates decisively, to the extent that when Mitchell of the National City Bank that we mentioned earlier, when he publicly defied the Fed in March 1929, injecting $25 million into the market to halt a panic, he was even hailed as a hero on Wall Street, even though he had effectively neutered the central bank's authority and allowed the bubble to inflate further. The crash itself then unfolds across several harrowing chapters. Black Thursday, October 24th, sees Thomas Lamont convene the nation's top bankers at JP Morgan's headquarters, where they pledge over $200 million to stabilize the market. Richard Whitney, the vice president of the New York Stock Exchange, strides onto the trading floor and ostentatiously bids above market prices for U.S. steel, a theatrical gesture that temporarily halts the panic. And then a Black Monday and a Black Tuesday follows, wiping out billions of dollars. What elevates the book 1929 beyond a mere crash narrative is Sorkin's extended treatment of the aftermath, where the book shifts from a disaster movie to a courtroom drama. The story also follows through the election of Franklin Roosevelt in 1932 and the devastating Pecora hearings in the Congress that exposed Wall Street's self-dealing. Those hearings, led by the prosecutor Ferdinand Pecora, are depicted at length in the book and serve as some sort of a national reckoning with the havoc wreaked by Wall Street elites. This prosecutor Pecora exposed a number of outrageous practices by the Wall Street elites, like the preferred list, where banking institutions like JP Morgan gave cheap stocks to politicians. And the climax was in Charles Mitchell's interrogation, when Pecora forced him to admit that he sold thousands of shares to his wife to establish a multi-million tax loss, avoiding all the income tax for 1929. That revelation destroyed the renowned banker. Similarly, JP Morgan Jr. was revealed to have paid no income tax in 1931 or 1932. The hearings attracted so much media attention to the extent that it literally became a circus, when even at one of the hearings, a press agent even brought a dwarf circus performer and placed her on Morgan's lap for a photo op. The book concludes with the passage of the Glass-Steagall Act in 1933, separating commercial and investment banking, among other reforms. Finally, the epilogue traces the fates of the key players. Durant dies broke in 1947, Livermore commits suicide in 1940, Richard Whitney, the White Knight of Black Thursday, is later imprisoned for embezzlement. Mitchell, though acquitted at trial, is left financially ruined. The greatest strength of this book is Sorkin's ability to transform economic history into gripping narrative, drawing on official documents, private letters, and archival transcripts. He reconstructs conversations and motivations with novelistic flair. He moves seamlessly from high-stakes negotiations in the boardroom of JP Morgan to the frantic floor of the NY Stock Exchange, and then to close quarters where politicians like Senator Carter Glass plot revenge on the bankers. Sorkin also does a good job at demystifying financial complexity, like explaining the mechanics of the era's market manipulation, how stock pools worked, how leverage compounded risk, etc. Impressively, or perhaps questionably, Sorkin humanizes Wall Street titans. It would have been understandable if he painted Mitchell or Lamont as villains. Instead, Sorkin shows them as men trapped by their own success. For example, Mitchell is portrayed as a man who truly believed he was helping the American public, viewing himself as a patriot fighting a restrictive government. This nuance makes the banker's eventual fall tragic, rather than merely satisfying. In my opinion, this is a downside of the book, and even more, it suffers from a significant great man bias. Sorkin views the history of this period almost exclusively through the eyes of the elite. The narrative makes the reader feel that the Great Depression was essentially a poker game gone wrong between a bunch of white men in Manhattan. While these men were the decision makers, the experiences of ordinary Americans are almost omitted. For example, the farmers already were suffering through the 1920s, agricultural depression, the factory workers have their own sufferings. All of them are largely absent from the book. It is ultimately the definite account of the crash, but perhaps not the definite account of the people it crushed. The book also diminishes global context. While there is material on German war reparations and the Young Plan, there is no mention of the European banking crisis of 1931, which many economic historians argue turned the recession into the Great Depression that we know. Also absent is the role of the social and political effect of the Great Depression in Europe, particularly in Germany, where it was the most important factor that brought the Nazis to power. So that's it, a brief overview of the book 1929 by Andrew Ross Sorkin, a sweeping cinematic history that brings to life the greatest crash in Wall Street history. Whether you are a finance or a history junkie or just someone who wants to understand how the world operates, I think this one might be worth your time. Thanks for listening, and until next time.